So welcome to the final session, session 3 for Unit 509 Finance. We're going to look at managing a budget, but really we've been talking about that throughout this unit. However, one of the primary uses of a budget is to control expenditure, and this can be done by monitoring expenditure against income. That gives us the aim of ensuring that expenditure does not exceed the available income or to track it along budget plans. Now, the first problem is identifying the sources of funds or expenses that are showing significant surpluses or deficits. And the easiest way for budget holders to do that is to spot significant variances by regularly reviewing the budget and reporting on it in accordance with the reporting requirements that we just discussed in the last session. And so our aims for this session, well, the aim is to know how to manage a budget. By the end of the session, you should be able to explain how to use a budget to control expenditure. Just started to talk about that. Explain the actions to be taken to manage variances in a budget and describe budget reporting requirements, including information to be included in a report, how often reports are required, and who the reports should be sent to. And as we just said, that can be one of the major ways to keep track of things within our budget. So let's get started. Right then, so of course responsibility for managing the budget will fall with the budget holder, whoever's been allocated that, and the individual organisations will have their own guidelines regarding whether they want budgets to balance or not. Now that might sound strange, but some organisations may wish to protect an imbalance of revenue over expenses, so a surplus in a budget, perhaps because they have plans for bigger other expenditure or they want a bigger contingency or safety net. For others, budget deficits might be acceptable in certain circumstances, such as where they need to invest and they know that the payback time is going to be quite a long time, so they might have to invest in new staff or to improve services, and they know they're not going to get that payback till later. But you need to know what the guidelines are within your organisation. But whatever your organisation decides, your focus should not just be on balancing the figures, but also on how the aims and objectives are being met and how the resources are being maximised. To do this, we can interpret information that we talked about, and we can monitor the budget against the plan, identifying and raising concerns when we identify any. What the exact process and the procedures are within your organisation will depend on the budget type and the situation, but there are some general steps that we will go through. So, as we said, there are some general steps we will go through as we control expenditure, and the first is to monitor our income. We need to know what is coming in, and if we're maintaining a surplus, that might include things such as interest payments. Second, we need to examine expenditure. What is being paid out? We need to track it. It could be anything from salaries to staff, building costs and energy, supplies, materials, administration costs, travel and assistance. But we might have to put processes in place to monitor all these things, to keep records and details, because we don't just want amounts, we'll need to know where it's gone, because we'll have to look at where it fits into the budget. And it might also involve us assigning authorities to spend as well, so the people who have authorities to spend without coming through the budgeting process, or they know that they've got to get approval. And in considering the amount of expenditure, we'll be looking at the actual and the notional. We'll be looking at all the costs incurred and attributing them to specific tasks or items. And in doing that, we'll need to be comparing the costs of expected costs against actual costs for different resources. Are the costs more or less than expected? Are we on sort of target for that? Are we going to be able to change the notional spend? And then, can we tie each cost to a specific task or activity, or is it something that's spread across all the activities, so that we can start to look at where things are over budget and where things are under budget? Some costs will vary across the different tasks depending on the level of activity, so how much we've been doing and if we're ahead of schedule or behind schedule. Others may be fixed and they won't change, but we need to be able to identify them to tasks as part of our budgetary responsibility if we're going to control expenditure. And we'll need that level of detail so that we can go through the third step of analysing costs. Depending on the guidelines or the situation, we may have to do this daily, weekly or monthly, and simplistically we're comparing what we have against what was planned, the outgoings and expenditure to the income. So are we in a surplus or a deficit? And doing this is going to allow us to report accurately on our budget, and more on that in a minute. So as we go through that process of monitoring expenditure and all those steps, we'll need information, and that might include things such as the planned budget for that area of activity, the full year budget, the actual income to date and the anticipated income, so the things that are what we've already received and what we're anticipating to receive, the actual expenditure to date, and any already committed future expenditure that we won't be able to change or go back on. A balance of the annual budget remaining, so what actual expenditure and commitments together added together compare to the full budget, and this will indicate the balance of our budget remaining at this point in time when the review is done, not at the end. And then the forecast outturn, and this is the expected position against the budget at the end of the year after taking into account all anticipated expenditure. The forecast outturn may not be equal to the original budget because it might be a situation where we're going to spend more than the budget. And for this, you should be able to make an analysis and identify any variances comparing the expenditure with the forecast outturn of the budget, and producing an action plan to address those variances. And at this stage, any concerns should be raised through your appropriate channels. And we mentioned there identifying variances, and there are a number of methods that can be employed to deal with variances, because what we're talking about a variance of actual performance against the agreed budget. Now, variance analysis is about the organisation looking into that little bit more detail and not only comparing the budget against the results, but identifying the reasons for the variance and then interpreting them so that they can mitigate against them. It can provoke questions such as that would come with continuous improvement, really, such as why it has happened, which department did it happen to, was it the production line, what product or service performed better or worse than others. So it's really, like you say, about identifying those things and trying to drive things forward. And the reasons variances occur can be for a number of reasons, and they impact in different ways, but the impact needs to be analysed and minimised, and that's why we need to break it down. So where possible, we sort of identify exactly what it is, and there are common methods for variances that we can look at, and this is not an exhaustive list. And this list appeared on the screen now, and as I said, this is not an exhaustive list, but we've got common variances in purchase price, so the actual price paid for materials used in the production or the output process differ from what we planned, so it could be they've gone up over time, or our estimates weren't very good, or there's been a shortage. And then there's labour costs, so the actual price paid for the direct labour used to create what it is that we're doing, the output, differs from that planned, either by individual cost or by the fact that we've had to produce more units than we first thought we were going to do. There could be variable overhead prices, so the planned overhead costs differ, usually increased, but it could be a saving near the end. There's fixed costs overhead, so we've exceeded what we expected to over that period, and that could be because we've extended, we've done more, or it could be just generally that we estimated the costs badly. There could be a selling price variance, so the value of the product we're producing isn't what we expected it to be at the end, so that's made a difference. There's a yield variance, so it could be down to the planned quantities, so what we got out of the resources we had, or how many we produced because the demand went up, for example. And then there's a production efficiency variance, so it could be that rates of production have changed, they're above or below the standard that we expected. And identifying those cost variances then from the analysation then allows us to explain away any positive or negative impacts on the budget. Most of these go to show how important the forecasting that we discussed earlier is, as most of these variances are all down to changes in what we forecasted, and they also highlights how important it is that we're regularly monitoring these and highlighting these variances before they have a critical impact on the budget. And we can use things such as we talked about before. We can resource smoothing or levelling can be employed. We can look at amendments to the budget, and we can put in budget change requests so that it's not becoming an issue, it's been highlighted. Or as we said, with this smoothing or levelling, it could just be a case of changing how we plan to do it for the rest of the period of budget to balance the books by the end. But if we do need to make some sort of amendments to the budget, there should be an organisational process for a budget change request, as I mentioned there, which will normally require people to analyse and justify a change to a budget. So and the main reason is so it can all be kept track of, really, not to check on you, but it involves input from the team and usually about the request being submitted for agreement by whatever the chain of command is, and the approval will normally go via account staff, or in the case of a project budget, the final approval will go to the project board. But it needs to be tracked so that any adjustments can be put into the overall budget reporting of the organisation. Budget reporting process is really important, and it allows the organisation overall to examine how it stands financially. Quarterly reports track spending and expenditure and income and ensure that they're on track to meet their budget's goals, and therefore the organisation can look at its overall budgets and see if any amendments are necessary. So you'll be reporting possibly as a documentation report or possibly a presentation where questions can be answered and variances and adjustments can be discussed. It may be a meeting, it may be a regular meeting, or it may be one-off meeting for budgets, and the successful budget report will address both the spending and future spending possibilities. And the reporting process structure should be part of the financial governance that we talked about, and it will cover things such as the information to be included in reports, how often reports are required. It will usually be quarterly and then annually as the budget completes, and who the report should be sent to and who should complete them. And generally, the reports will include things such as details of spending for the period, say for the last quarter if it's a quarterly report, or for the whole year if it's the fiscal year report. And it should summarise the spending in each category area of the budget, possibly have appendices which will list the individual expenses for each area and category. And if there are any questions regarding specific spending during the meeting, this will provide an easy reference point. It should give spending forecasts for the periods, the next quarter and the remaining of the fiscal year. You don't need to be as specific with the expected spending as you are with what's already been spent, but it should still go through the process of giving an outline, and then the expected earnings for the next quarter and the remaining of the fiscal year if it's a quarterly report. And this will probably be a formal reporting process on a quarterly and annual process, but informal meetings will take place more often than that probably, or if there is an exception occurring with the budget, then these could be increased. So who's going to use these budget reports and what are they all for? Well, the business owners, senior executives will read and use the overall budget report to create financial plans and projects, decide what the company is going to do within the limits of what they got. They might also use them to reallocate surpluses to different budgets. All of this in the hope of increasing annual profit and turnover. All the plans of growth and expansion will also be based on these overall budget reports, and they'll be read by investors and stakeholders where appropriate. Investors are going to be interested in reading and evaluating how the business is operating and doing financially before they make any financial decisions about how they're going to invest in the company or whether they're going to sell or buy shares. So it usually be an overall budget report prepared by accounts, which will consist of an amalgamation of the smaller individual budget reports and bring together the overall picture, with charts and presentations, because they're good for presenting quantitative data. And the overall report will be put together using all that budget info to give predicted future decisions and sections on that, and show the expected growth and plans for the organisation, and used for all the fiscal reporting that needs to be done for company's house, etc., or for any finances that are being used. So that brings together all the financial reports and why it's important that what we're producing for our budgetary reports is factual and correct. So we're coming to the end of this unit now and to the end of this session, and the aim of this session was to know how to manage a budget. We said by the end of the session you'd be able to explain how to use a budget to control expenditure, and we've looked at that. explain the actions to take to manage variances in a budget, and we've talked about how you would work out what the variance is. And then thirdly, describe budget reporting requirements, including, and there's 3 bullet points there. Now they're included in an activity. We've talked about them generally, but you'll be looking at your own organisation and outlining those for the activity. So let's have a look at that. Right then, so it's a 2-part activity, and it's really just about going over what we've covered generally in this session and looking at how it fits within your organisation. I would say that it's really good if you use an example within your organisation to explain, because what you need to do with part 1 is explain the information contained in a budget and how to use it to control expenditure. So you'll be looking at the bits and pieces that are in there, and it's good if you can use real examples to explain that and how it would be used to control expenditure. And in doing that, you should be able to show understanding of variance analysis and actions to control it. So using the real example will help you to show where variance is. So you don't need the facts and figures, you just need to explain the processes and what's gone on within a budget. And then part 2 is to describe the principal features of budget reporting. We've talked about the principles of it, and then I think again, if you look at your own organisation and see how budgets are reported and what the processes are, you can fill in the details and the understanding to show that you've passed that. So if you complete that and upload it, you can talk to your assessor about where to go next.